Arizona, summer 1945. The desert breathes heat like an open furnace. Mirage ripples rise from the gravel road snaking toward Camp Florence, an American guard post etched into sand and silence. Dust plumes appear first, then the low growl of engines. U.S. Army trucks grind to a halt under the glare of an afternoon sun that spares no one. The soldiers climb down, boots clicking against the blistered earth. Their sleeves are rolled, rifles slung casually. Routine, not alarm. In the back of the trucks, young German women hesitate before stepping out, their uniforms creased from days of travel. They expect hard faces and shackles, the weight of defeat heavy on their ribs. Instead, a supply sergeant gestures to a table. On it, folded cotton dresses, simple, pale, smelling faintly of soap. Bars of ivory-colored soap, rough towels stacked beside them. No barbed confrontation, no shouting. Only the hollow buzz of insects, the wind and quiet instructions translated by a corporal with halting German. For a heartbeat, the women do not move. Then one of them, a nurse from Lübeck, reaches toward the fabric with trembling fingers. That was the first moment they realized America's captivity would not mean chains. It would mean something entirely unexpected. By the final spring of 1945, the Reich was collapsing in on itself. Soviet artillery was thundering across the Oder. Allied bombers roared over the Rhineland. Every convoy, every field hospital, every signal station felt the tightening noose of defeat. Among the thousands swept up by advancing forces were not only soldiers, but also the women who had served the German war machine in uniformed auxiliary roles, nurses, typists, radio operators of the Luftnachrichtenhelferinnen. Their posts had never been near the front lines, but proximity to the military hierarchy placed them squarely in the Allies' net when surrender came. The United States, like Britain, faced the logistical riddle of what to do with millions of prisoners of war. European camps overflowed. Disease, scarcity, and political instability made housing vast numbers of German captives near the battlefields dangerous. Washington decided to move many thousands across the Atlantic. Between 1943 and 1946, close to 500,000 German POWs would find themselves housed in more than 500 camps scattered across the American mainland. From Maine's pine forests to the deserts of the Southwest, Arizona, of all places, seemed an unlikely new home for Europe's enemies. Yet its empty expanses, dry climate, and distance from any coastline made it ideal for large-scale internment. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers established several facilities: Camp Florence near Tucson, Papago Park outside Phoenix, and a constellation of branch camps stretched out toward Yuma and Scottsdale. Most were originally designed for Italian POWs captured in North Africa. By mid-1945, they were housing Germans instead. The female POWs were a peculiarity even among captured personnel. In Arizona's records, their numbers never exceeded a few hundred, and many were attached to nursing units or Air Force communication detachments. These were not combatants in the traditional sense. Nonetheless, under the Geneva Convention, they fell under the same protections and restrictions as male prisoners. When the trains carrying them rolled into the Southwest, the contrast to what they left behind in Europe was staggering. The ruins of German cities smoldering, food queues stretching down cracked streets, and the omnipresence of fear. Here, in the blistering openness of the Sonoran desert, lay order, rows of tan tents, wooden barracks, irrigation canals glinting in the sun, American flags fluttering lazily above guard towers. What awaited them inside was a paradox of military efficiency and unexpected compassion. Army regulations required that all POWs receive housing, food, and medical care equivalent to that of U.S. troops, an obligation the War Department largely honored. It was not altruism but strategy. Humane treatment ensured, reciprocal conditions for Americans held overseas, and demonstrated democracy's moral fiber at war's most brutal. Peaked out auxiliary women arriving in Arizona soon learned that captivity in the United States would defy their propaganda-fed expectations. They had been told they would face cruelty and maybe torture at the hands of the enemy. Instead, they found libraries, classrooms, sewing facilities, and organized camp councils supervised by American officers. The desert heat was merciless, but there was water, structure, and, most unexpectedly, dignity. Still, the emotional dissonance was profound. Many women felt the gnawing weight of humiliation. uniforms stripped, rank dissolved, their purpose as cogs in a defeated empire suddenly meaningless. Others sensed relief bordering on guilt. Relief to sleep without air raid sirens, to eat without ration stamps. Beyond the camp fences, Arizona itself was undergoing a transformation. The wartime boom had swelled its airfields and training bases. Thousands of uniformed Americans crowded the small towns surrounding the POW sites, and local civilians would occasionally glimpse the foreign captives working in the distance, clearing brush, tending farms, repairing irrigation ditches. The rumor quickly spread, "There are German women here now." For many locals, the idea was both exotic and humanizing, dissolving war's abstraction into a face and voice behind the wire. In the months to come, those quiet, sun-beaten compounds would become small laboratories of human decency, under severe circumstance, where former enemies shared recipes across fences and discovered that soap and thread could wield more power than chains and guns, and that paradox began with America's decision to plant camps in its own deserts. The American decision to place POW camps in Arizona was both calculated and practical. The War Department sought locations far from major cities or industrial centers, minimizing escape risk and potential sabotage. Arizona's sparse population and vast stretches of uninhabited desert provided natural containment. Even if a prisoner fled, there was nowhere to go but heat, dust, and distance. Camp Florence, where many of the German women eventually arrived, had been constructed in 1943, initially for Italian prisoners captured in North Africa. It sat about 65 miles south of Phoenix, a grid of low barracks, water towers, and dusty parade grounds framed by the jagged horizon of the Santan Mountains. The facility was large even by wartime standards, designed to hold up to 18,000 prisoners, though its population rarely reached that number. Like other U.S. POW installations, Florence operated under strict adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention. Every prisoner was registered, issued identification, and provided the same caloric intake as American troops in training bases nearby. Mail delivery was regular. Red Cross parcels arrived punctually. To the U.S. Army administrators, humane treatment wasn't a sentimental gesture, but a matter of discipline and image, a demonstration that democracy did not need cruelty to assert its strength. By early 1945, the first groups of female German auxiliaries began to arrive by rail, transported from ports on the East Coast, where they had disembarked after capture in Europe. Their convoy mirrored that of POW transports all over the nation, guarded yet casual, more bureaucratic than threatening. When the train doors slid open at Florence siding, the blast of dry air hit like a wall, the lungful of freedom's opposite. American officers at the camp noted initial bewilderment among the newcomers. Many of the women had scarcely set foot outside Europe. They found the landscape alien, biblical, almost otherworldly. Cacti rose like sentinels, and the sun seemed not to move. Unseen cicadas filled each void of sound with their metallic whine. The camp staff, accustomed to processing columns of uniformed men, had to improvise arrangements for separate housing, sanitation, and modesty needs. Within weeks, routines settled into place. Roll calls at dawn, meals in open-air mess halls, instruction periods for English, typing, sewing, and agriculture. The Army's re-education division saw opportunity in these quiet months, captivity not only as detention, but also as moral rehabilitation. Pamphlets on democratic principles circulated through the compound. Motion picture nights screened American documentaries, often with unexpected curiosity from women raised on Reich propaganda. The most astonishing encounter, however, was the personal one. Guards and administrators who spoke respectfully, without the triumphant sneer of conquerors. Lieutenant James Dunbar, part of the Florence security detail, later wrote of how the German girls waited for punishment that never came. Instead of interrogation rooms, they were issued linen dresses, symbols of restored individuality. Instead of a cell, they received a bed, sheets, and soap. Local reaction wavered between fascination and suspicion. Newspapers occasionally mentioned Hitler's helpers living quietly behind wire, sparking debate. Should the enemy live so comfortably while American sons fought overseas? Yet others saw it differently. Harvesting under the desert sun, the German women joined typical POW work detachments, picking cotton and melons, packaging supplies for nearby farms. Farmers, short of manpower due to enlistments, willingly cooperated with camp authorities. And through brief supervised contacts, seeds of odd friendships formed, hands passing fruit crates across language divides. The presence of women softened the image of the enemy German. They laughed, stumbled through English phrases, spoke of homes and families. For the American soldiers on guard duty, it was disarming. For the local population, unsettling and strangely humanizing. Inside the barbed wire, though, contradictions persisted. Some of the German POWs still clung to fragments of Nazi ideology. Others were ashamed of it. Camp newsletters reflected cautious debates. Religion revived. A small wooden chapel hosted both Lutheran and Catholic services under the desert sun. Arizona's serene monotony did not dull the war beyond the oceans. It merely framed its consequences. Every meal handed to a captured woman represented a quiet statement from America that the nation's strength lay not in chains, but in civilization. From this baseline of dignity, the story of these women's adaptation and transformation would unfold. As the days lengthened and rumors of Germany's downfall filtered through, the desert's silence began to vibrate with uncertainty. What would become of them once the Reich was no more? The answer would come soon, through a series of intimate human encounters that tested every conviction about enemies and mercy. To live in a prison of compassion was its own psychological puzzle. Many of the German women awoke each morning expecting some new humiliation that never came. The shock of survival in Arizona was not the deprivation of food or rights, but the lack of hatred. When they first visited the camp washrooms and found soap, combs and towels neatly arranged, a few of them cried, not from joy but from displacement, tenderness where they expected brutality. Inside the fence, life stabilized into patterns of surprising normalcy. Prisoners tended vegetable gardens under the watch of relaxed guards. The mess hall served meals of beans, rice, and occasional meat. Monotony, not starvation, was the enemy. Some of the women who had been nurses resumed tending the sick, assisting American medics in medical wards. Others mended uniforms and sewed dresses from surplus cloth to replace their worn Wehrmacht kit. Language became the bridge. Curious Americans learned German phrases. The women tested their hesitant English. There were letters home, filtered through censors but still lifelines to a shattered continent. One survivor would later write that the desert sunsets, though foreign, gave her a sense of still being under one heaven with Germany. Running a camp that housed women captured among predominantly male prisoners demanded adjustment. The U.S. Army's chain of command imposed the same discipline across all POW installations: strict schedules, salutes, inspection routines. But Florence's administrators recognized they were handling a demographic outside ordinary Army manuals. Separate barracks, washhouses, and work assignments were arranged. A female detachment of the Women's Army Corps occasionally supervised domestic training and re-education sessions, though overall authority remained male. The Army's policy framework followed three pillars: security, productivity, and ideological engagement. Security in Arizona was almost self-enforcing. The formidable geography and distances made large-scale escape nearly futile. Productivity was achieved through work programs, agriculture, textile repair, and even limited clerical support for camp operations. The desert's unrelenting rhythm made the efficiency of these tasks oddly comforting for the prisoners. Ideological engagement came through what officials euphemistically called intellectual reorientation. Classes in English, geography, and democratic civics were offered. The female POWs, often better educated than their male counterparts, responded with curiosity and skepticism. The concept of being taught morality by an enemy exposed internal tension, yet curiosity often turned to reflection. They debated among themselves. Was this decency genuine, or was it another kind of propaganda? To American officers, the experiment was moral strategy as much as humanitarian conduct. Every newsletter published, every re-education class attended, projected the image of a strong, confident democracy, whose conscience remained intact even in victory. This interplay of order and humanity would soon test both the captives and their keepers. Life in Arizona offered strange glimpses of cultural exchange. Music drifted from barracks at night. German folk tunes played softly on harmonicas and borrowed guitars. Nearby, American sentries would hum along, off-key, separated by fences and ideology. The women improvised theater groups, staging small performances translated from Goethe or Schiller, and sometimes comic sketches poking gentle fun at camp life. For the American staff, the performances were curiosities. For the women, they were reclamations of identity. To sing, laugh, and dress in patterns of their choice. These acts reclaimed something the war had eroded. Among the prisoner audience were both skeptics and participants, but artistic expression became a gentle insurgency against despair. Religion also crossed lines. Sunday services occasionally saw Christian hymns sung in German, while Protestant chaplains read scripture in English. Silence did the translation. More remarkable still was how the desert filtered emotion. Isolation stripped away the noise of ideology, leaving only heat, wind, and introspection. For many of the captured auxiliaries, cracks began to appear in their inherited beliefs. The war's moral script dissolved beneath the Arizona sun. They began to see America not as caricature, but as contradiction, an enemy capable of mercy, a victor that offered soap instead of punishment. In subtle ways, the culture of kindness was reshaping their understanding of what strength meant. That emergent understanding would deepen as the days of captivity grew longer and the outside world shifted from ongoing war to the moment of surrender. But before that turning point, there were still more dimensions through which the Arizona desert revealed the paradox of victory's humanity. Captain Harold G. Stassen, commanding officer at Camp Florence, was neither idealist nor philosopher. He was a career soldier who believed in discipline, schedules, and paperwork, measured in inches. Yet even he recognized that the treatment of prisoners was a moral test as much as a logistical one. Under his supervision, the camp maintained strict order without cruelty. Guards were instructed, firm, not harsh. They're defeated, not animals. Such guidance echoed throughout the U.S. POW system. The War Department had circulated memoranda emphasizing that the dignity afforded to prisoners was to signal to the world that American strength included conscience. It was also pragmatic. Fair treatment could elicit cooperation, reduce sabotage, and demonstrate democracy's contrast to fascism. Under this ethos, Stassen granted permission for the camp's education programs, correspondence courses, and even a small women's workshop where the POWs could craft garments, knit shawls, or repair clothing. The women's daily reports recorded minimal disciplinary infractions, astonishing for a population raised on militarism now trapped halfway across the world. Leadership at Florence thus became a quiet dialogue. The authority of command met the responsibility of decency, and in that intersection, seeds of respect emerged between overseer and captive. Beyond the camp fences, the war had strained American society's patience. Rationing, combat casualties, and propaganda left many citizens intolerant of the idea that enemy prisoners could live comfortably. Editorial letters to Arizona newspapers complained that Nazis eat better than taxpayers. Yet when locals caught glimpses of the German women, picking cotton, harvesting alfalfa, waving shyly from trucks, resentment often melted into uneasy empathy. Human curiosity eroded stereotypes. Farmers who hired POW labor via army contracts witnessed cooperative, disciplined workers who thanked them in broken English. Young American women working side by side with the prisoners discovered their shared youth and worry for brothers fighting overseas. There were still moments of tension, occasional slurs, glares, and reminders that these were the women of an enemy nation responsible for immense suffering. But humanity, once seen up close, rarely retreated entirely into hatred. The U.S. Army, aware of the delicate optics, closely monitored interactions. Suspicions of fraternization led to transfers or tighter supervision. But stories persisted of small gestures, a farmer's daughter slipping a letter of thanks through the fence, a guard passing a photograph of his child to show what peace could look like. The moral reckoning played out quietly. The prisoners had been instruments of a regime that devalued human life. Now they were recipients of a system that upheld it. The contradiction gnawed subtly but persistently, forcing many to rethink where guilt ended and where responsibility began. Captivity's hardest frontier was inward. For many of the German women, the Arizona desert became a mirror. reflecting not the enemy's cruelty but their own illusions. Days stretched into weeks of relentless clarity under a sun that burned away excuses. The desert's silence pressed questions that few had dared to ask during the war. What had they truly believed in? What were they now, stripped of uniforms and purpose? Letters from home were filled with uncertainty, fragments of ruin. Cities gone, families scattered, loved ones missing. In the loneliness of captivity, grief met relief. Some clung to memories of comrades in Europe. Others began to detach themselves from the ideology that had entangled them. For American psychologists studying POW behavior, the women's responses were remarkable. Reports from Florence noted lower disciplinary problems and less ideological rigidity compared with some male POW camps. Analysts speculated that the humane environment accelerated what they called denazification by decency. The desert, the structure, the small freedoms all combined to erode fanaticism more effectively than lectures alone. The women were changing, not through coercion, but exposure to a different moral climate. What unfolded in Arizona was part of a larger American experiment that stretched across the continent. From Maine to Texas, from the Carolinas to California, millions of words were written about the conduct of enemy prisoners, but the Arizona camp stood out for their serenity and the symbolic power of their landscape. Here, under the unblinking sun, America tested whether moral restraint could survive total war's aftermath. The experiment worked quietly. Few outside officials visited Camp Florence. Fewer still remembered it afterward, but those who did sensed that something profound lay in the simplicity of soap, dresses, and orderly kindness. When American soldiers packed away the camp's files after the war, they recorded no uprisings, no mass escapes, no acts of revenge. Only lives paused, examined, and eventually released. For the women inside, the days continued, routine upon routine, until the rumors of surrender spread through the fences like a rising wind. The war that had carried them across continents was ending. What would freedom mean now, when their homeland no longer existed as they knew it? That question would erupt into the camp's defining moment, the surrender of Germany, heard through static-filled radios on a day when the desert turned impossibly silent, May 8, 1945. The morning began like any other at Camp Florence, sun ascending over sand ridges, the faint clang of kitchen mess tins, guards pacing the fences in routine quiet. Then came the static. In the administrative hut, a sergeant adjusted the shortwave dial, nudging through fragments of news from San Francisco and London. When the signals finally cleared, the words carried across the room, "Germany has unconditionally surrendered." By late noon, the news had crossed every fence in the compound. Guards whispered it, interpreters confirmed it, and then came the stunned silence of translation. For the German women, the words were both liberation and annihilation. The nation they belonged to no longer existed. The eagle, the flag, the system that had filled their youth with certainty, all gone overnight. Some walked outside blindly, as if gravity itself had changed. Others sank onto the barracks steps, faces rigid in shock. A few wept openly, shoulders shaking under the white glare of Arizona sun. Lieutenant Dunbar ordered formations, reading aloud the War Department memorandum confirming the surrender. His voice cracked once, not from pity or triumph, but from an awareness of what the moment meant. It was a historical full stop written in sand and heat. In the mess hall that night, hardly anyone ate. The clatter of trays ceased. Spoons rested untouched. One woman stared at her food for an hour, whispering the same question again and again. Was for land? What country? Outside the wire, American soldiers listened to radio celebrations from Phoenix and Los Angeles. Jazz, car horns, and delirious cheers echoing through victory parades. Inside the compound, the same victory sounded like a funeral. For days afterward, the camp's emotional atmosphere wavered between mourning and relief. Some prisoners felt an unexpected lightness the war was over. Bombs would no longer fall on their families. Others felt rootless despair. They were no longer captives of an enemy state, but refugees of history itself. In this fragile equilibrium, the humane policy the Americans had practiced for months suddenly took on new gravity. Guards refrained from the slightest gloating. Instead, they offered small gestures, extra sugar, a kind word, longer hours in the courtyard. The army chaplain held combined services, reading in English and then allowing the German pastor among the prisoners to answer. Together, their prayers carried no flag. It was in these days that meaning shifted again. Soap and dresses once symbolized leniency. Now they symbolized beginning, from ashes, through decency, into whatever would come next. The captives began to help one another write letters for the Red Cross, inquiring after families scattered across a broken Europe. Women who had clung fiercely to ideological purity retreated into silence. Those who had doubted before now voiced gratitude aloud. They spoke of America not as savior nor enemy, but as mirror, showing them what was possible when war's hatred was refused. One evening in mid-May, under a bruise-colored sunset, a group of women gathered near the western fence, singing softly, a song of home, not victory. The guards stood motionless. No order forbade music. The wind carried German words out over cactus and gravel until they dissolved into the horizon. For the first time since their capture, the sound of peace felt real. But beyond the calm, uncertainty brewed. Not all prisoners accepted defeat gracefully. Among small male detachments at other Arizona sites, whispers of escape or acts of defiance flared briefly before subsiding. Camp Florence remained largely tranquil, yet the awareness spread. Repatriation would not be immediate. War's paperwork continued long after surrender. They would remain for months, perhaps a year, while the world reorganized itself. During this suspended time, change hardened into introspection. The desert seemed to breathe different air, spent, tired, and expectant. Wounded ideologies crumbled with each sunset. America had won militarily long before. Now it appeared to be winning morally. The climax of the Arizona experience was not a battle or an uprising, but surrender in its purest sense, the moment when enemies ceased to exist as enemies, when the victors preserved dignity not by conquest but by compassion. From that moment forward, Camp Florence was no longer a fragment of war. It became a rehearsal for peace. The days following Germany's surrender brought a quiet revolution to the Arizona desert. Beneath skies so bright they seemed unreal, the camp settled into a fragile rhythm of waiting. No longer an outpost of war, yet not free to dissolve back into the world. For both Americans and Germans, the question shifted from command to conscience. How should victors live alongside the vanquished? Within a week, the War Department ordered the lowering of the German flag that had hung, folded and unused, in administrative storage since the women's arrival. The camp bugler played a muted version of taps. This impromptu ceremony, conducted in silence, was witnessed by 24 German women and an equal number of guards. There were no speeches, only the sound of fabric folding upon itself, an empire reduced to cloth. Soon after, a new tradition emerged. Each Sunday, volunteers among the POWs taught the English alphabet to others who had never learned it. They used chalk and bits of broken slate. The act was small but symbolic. Instead of marching drills, there were lessons. Instead of orders, dialogue. This was how occupied minds began to liberate themselves. Meanwhile, camp administrators faced their own reckoning. Some officers, having seen horrors of the European theater, now realized that history's measure of a victor was not the number of enemies killed, but the restraint shown after victory. Captain Stassen wrote in his report, "Perhaps the purpose of their presence here is partly to remind us of what we fought for." There were moments that tested that philosophy. One evening that June, a misplaced rumor spread that certain guards had mocked the prisoners by playing exaggerated victory music over the loudspeakers. Tension stiffened the camp's air. But at sunrise, the captain convened both his men and the senior German orderly, clarified the misunderstanding, and ordered the music replaced with a neutral broadcast of classical compositions. It was a gesture of control, not of generosity alone, but of responsibility. In one letter home, a German nurse recounted that day, "They treat us as equals in sorrow, not triumph." For the prisoners, existence narrowed into introspection. They kept diaries in secret, describing a growing mixture of remorse and gratitude. A few wrote that the desert's emptiness had become their cloister, a place to unlearn obedience to false idols. They spoke about freedom not as travel or release, but as the ability to see truth without fear. By midsummer 1945, the heat climbed past 110 degrees. Sandstorms scoured the horizon. Inside the camp, canvas roofs beat like drums. Yet even in that harshness, mutual trust thickened. Guards would sometimes step aside to allow prisoners to rest under sparse shade, sharing canteens. American rations remained consistent, though shortages hit across the nation. Each meal eaten side by side, enemy and jailer separated only by uniform, became another elusive step toward reconciliation before the word existed. As global headlines shifted to the Pacific and the atomic bomb, the desert camp entered historical invisibility. Bureaucracy took over. Lists of repatriation priority, transport manifests, health clearances. But for those living behind the barbed wire, meaning still felt personal, almost sacred. One August evening, as dusk softened the edges of the camp, the women were summoned to an outdoor assembly. The American flag lowered in ceremony. A colonel read aloud the president's announcement of Japan's surrender, war's final curtain. For the first time, the entire world was at peace. Silence followed, vast and inward. Some women covered their faces. Others stared at the horizon, unsure how to inhabit a world where mercy had survived everything. That night, the camp's chapel filled beyond capacity. Hymns mixed German and English verses. The walls absorbed two languages praying for the same future. Guards stood in the back, caps removed. The chaplain's closing words, translated by a German teacher, echoed softly through the desert heat. The enemy you forgive will be the peace you inherit. In that silence, hearts shifted another fraction toward humanity. The next morning, life went on. Breakfast, roll call, repairs, the wind. Yet none of it felt the same. Captivity had become a moral classroom, and both sides were its pupils. The Arizona horizon shimmered like a great unwritten future. The war was finished. The work of remembering kindly had only just begun. And from the stillness of Camp Florence, a new story, half German, half American, prepared to take its first uncertain steps toward the peacetime world. By autumn 1945, Camp Florence no longer pulsed with the tension of a war installation. The watchtowers still stood, but their silhouettes felt symbolic rather than threatening. Cacti bloomed around the wire. Inside, the prisoners lived in a paradoxical peace, safe yet far from home, free from bombs yet fenced by patience. The U.S. War Department began planning the slow repatriation of prisoners. Priority went to the sick, then to those captured earliest. Bureaucracy turned human destiny into paperwork, serial numbers, clearance stamps, transport schedules. For the women in Arizona, rumors of return swept the barracks weekly. Ships loading in New York, trains readying for the East Coast. Yet weeks stretched into months. Their homeland needed sorting, not arrivals. Germany was rubble and administration. Meanwhile, the camp continued to function like a miniature society under the desert sun. Daily records from 1946 describe hygiene inspections, language classes, small concerts, and farm work. But something deeper had changed. Relations between guards and prisoners had softened to an unexpected normalcy. When the Army allowed POW performances open to local civilians, curiosity brought townspeople into a setting they had once feared. The German women wore simple dresses, not uniforms, and sang folk songs of home. Applause came cautiously, then warmly. For both sides, it was an exhale of old tension. The American officers sent detailed accounts of these scenes to Washington. Their correspondence reads almost academic, statistics of morale, work output, health. But beneath the numbers was another story. Compassion had proven both manageable and efficient. Trouble declined. Cooperation rose. A camp run with decency required fewer punishments than one run with intimidation. When the International Red Cross inspected Florence in early 1946, they reported commendable standards of welfare and education, rare praise in the global landscape of detention. Geneva Convention observers noted with quiet astonishment that some prisoners did not wish for immediate repatriation, fearing what awaited in occupied Germany, scarcity, chaos, ideological suspicion. By mid-1946, orders finally arrived. The first ships would depart from the East Coast that summer. Each name on the Florence list represented a closed circle: capture, captivity, rebirth. The women prepared for leaving much as they had prepared for arrival, packing neat bundles, photographs, trinkets made from scrap wood, carefully folded cotton dresses once issued by their keepers. A few asked if they could take bars of the same coarse soap, tokens of something they couldn't quite name. Departure day was unsentimental but heavy. Trucks idled under the merciless morning sky while American MPs checked manifests. A handful of guards shook hands with the prisoners they had known for over a year. Smiles were awkward, words minimal. The American habit of understatement disguised the depth of mutual respect built in those months of shared endurance. As the convoy rolled north toward rail transport, the desert swallowed the tracks of the tires almost instantly. Camp Florence remained half dismantled, its barracks soon to be reused for returning American veterans. What had begun as a logistical solution had evolved into a moral landmark, a place where peace was rehearsed, while the world learned how to rebuild itself from ashes. Yet the true aftermath would unfold far from Arizona, in the minds of those sent home to a changed continent. They carried with them not stories of torture or deprivation, but of soap, dresses, and surprise. It was a memory that clashed with the ruin awaiting them across the Atlantic, and one that would quietly shape the next chapter of U.S.-German relations. Germany in 1946 was not a homeland in the way the returning prisoners remembered. It was a scar of a country, divided into zones watched by foreign uniforms and haunted by absences. When the women from Camp Florence disembarked on European soil, they faced not homecomings but reckonings. Their dresses, once symbols of dignity restored, now stood out among crowds in gray. Their tales of American civility drew disbelief from those who had endured occupation's hardships and the revelations of the concentration camps. To speak of kindness received from enemies felt almost indecent amid such collective grief. Many stayed silent. Yet silence did not erase the impression the desert had left on them, the slow awakening that human worth need not depend on ideology. In small circles, former prisoners wrote to one another, describing post-war struggles and the surreal tranquility of Arizona nights that had carried no gunfire. Over time, their memories formed a quiet mosaic of reconciliation, not orchestrated by treaties or governments, but by the lived contrast between cruelty expected and humanity given. For America, the legacy of its POW program resonated quietly in military doctrine. Files from the War Department circulated through staff colleges, citing the Arizona experience as evidence that disciplined kindness promoted order more effectively than punitive authority. The Florence camp became a reference point in lectures about psychological warfare and democratic resilience, proof that mercy could serve strategy. Yet the most telling aftermath unfolded in the private conscience of those ordinary Americans who had guarded the camps. Years later, some veterans revisited their journals with amazement at their own restraint. One recalled, "We learned that defeating an enemy can happen without hatred. Maybe that's what victory really is." Such reflections fueled a subtle evolution in the U.S. military's post-war ethos, a conviction that the moral conduct of victory mattered as much as its achievement. In Arizona itself, traces of the camp faded. Barracks were dismantled, towers torn down, their lumber sold locally. The desert reclaimed the land with its slow, meticulous patience. Today, only a foundation slab and a state marker remember Camp Florence. Winds scrolling across sand carry no hint that this stretch of earth once held the defeated soldiers of a fallen empire, nurtured under enemy care. Historians later pieced the story back together from Army reports, Red Cross archives, and the fading testimonies of those who had lived it. They found nothing dramatic, no daring escapes, no riots, no mutinies. But that absence of drama was the drama itself. It was the kind of peace earned not at the summit of conferences, but in the micro-decisions of daily restraint, empathy, and procedural fairness. When former prisoners reflected decades later, many spoke of the first day they received the soap and dresses. It had seemed so trivial, yet in retrospect it became the symbol of a threshold crossed. From fear into dignity, one wrote, "They conquered us without raising their voices." That was the victory none of us expected. That insight, simple, unrecorded in policy yet profound, became the spiritual epilogue of the desert camps. By the close of 1947, the last transports had sailed. America's POW chapter was closed. Camp Florence became a ghost of timetables and sand. But in a world learning to rebuild nations and conscience alike, the memory of those women in Arizona stood as proof that mercy, once practiced, leaves a residue even stronger than hate. And from that residue, a different peace quietly endured. Today, the Arizona desert gives no clue of its wartime secret. The sun burns the same. The wind combs across empty land and lizards cross where guard towers once threw shadows. Only a single bronze marker speaks for what happened here. Lines of memory etched into silence. Yet in that silence lies one of the rarest outcomes of war, the victory of restraint. Camp Florence never entered the grand narratives of World War II because its story lacked spectacle. No battles, no heroes carved from legend. Instead, it tells of ordinary decency sustained amid global cruelty. Soap, fabric, patience. These were its weapons. For the German women who passed through those fences, Arizona became a mirror too bright to forget. In later decades, a few would visit the site with their grandchildren, pointing at nothing visible and saying only, "Here, they gave us kindness." No memorial needed. The desert itself had kept the lesson. For America, the legacy was quieter but enduring. The experience affirmed that democracy's true strength lies not in how fiercely it fights, but in how justly it triumphs. The humane treatment of enemies underlined that moral purpose must survive even when war demands everything else. The world has seen many camps built from barbed wire and fear. Camp Florence was built from barbed wire and rules, but filled with something unexpected: belief that civilization could outperform vengeance. And so the story of those German women, clothed not in punishment but in mercy, endures as a whisper across the years. It reminds us that after the guns fall silent, nations are judged not only by how they fought, but by what they refused to become. In the stillness of the Arizona heat, humanity passed its quietest test and for once did not fail.